Imagine taking a dying houseplant, locking it in a dark closet, and returning a few weeks later to find it hasn't just survived, but it actually doubled in size.
I mean, it sounds like a complete biological impossibility, right?
Right. It makes absolutely no sense, but that is exactly what the latest climate models suggest could happen to the Amazon rainforest if humanity intentionally decides to, dim the sun.
Which is just a wild concept to even be talking about as a reality.
It really is.
Yeah.
But if you follow climate science, you already know we're in uncharted territory right now. The 2024 data came in, and we hit a global warming mark of 1.55 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels.
Yeah, that was a huge wake-up call.
Exactly. We practically breached the Paris Agreement's most ambitious target in a single blistering year. And when you see a data point like that, it forces a real shift in the conversation. We start moving past prevention and start looking at the absolute extremes of intervention.
It forces the scientific community to model scenarios that, honestly, even a decade ago were considered just too radical to touch. We're looking at literal emergency measures now.
Which brings us to the mission of this deep dive. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating, highly controversial research paper. It was published in April 2026 by Isabel M. Perry and her colleagues.
Yeah, and they didn't just theorize about these extreme measures. They actually ran the hard math on a concept called stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI.
Basically, we're talking about intentionally altering the amount of solar radiation reaching the Earth, just seeing if we can artificially force the planet's thermostat down.
What's fascinating here is if you picture the visual backdrop for this research, you have to imagine a digital glowing map of global weather systems. Swirling currents, deep blues and greens, just pulsing with massive data sets.
Oh, totally, like a supercomputer simulation.
Exactly. Because the researchers used 5 of the absolute latest, most sophisticated Earth system models, the CMIP6 generation, to test this exact scenario out to the year 2100. This isn't speculative science fiction anymore.
Okay, let's unpack this because I want to focus on the mechanism first. Hacking the climate or dimming the sun, it sounds like a cartoon villain's plot.
Right. It does sound a bit nefarious.
I mean, we aren't launching a giant mirror into orbit, right? We're talking about fleets of high-altitude aircraft continuously spraying millions of tons of reflective aerosols, like sulfur dioxide, into the stratosphere.
Yeah, but the theory is actually grounded in completely natural phenomena. Stratospheric aerosol injection is essentially just an attempt to mimic a massive explosive volcano.
It's like a controlled eruption.
Sort of. When a major geological event like that happens naturally, the Earth defends itself, in a way. The volcano blasts sulfur dioxide so high into the atmosphere that it clears the active weather system.
Oh, I see. It gets above the rain and the clouds.
Exactly. Up in the stratosphere, it oxidizes and forms this microfine reflective layer of aerosols. And that layer literally bounces a measurable percentage of incoming sunlight right back into space before it can trap heat below.
Wait, since we've never built a global sun-dimming machine, how do we know the computer models aren't just making wild guesses? I mean, the Earth's ecosystem is infinitely chaotic.
That skepticism is entirely warranted. But the researchers address it by calibrating their models against real recorded history. We actually have really robust proxies for this exact atmospheric dynamic.
You mean historical volcanoes?
Yes. The scientific community has decades of detailed global data tracking the aftermath of massive eruptions.
Yeah.
We're talking Krakatoa in 1883, Agung in 1963, El Chichon in 1982, and most importantly, Mount Pinatubo in 1991.
Oh, right. Pinatubo is the classic example. I remember reading that the 91 eruption injected something like 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the air.
That's right.
And it actually cooled the entire planet by about 0.5 degree Celsius for over a year, didn't it?
It did. But what is deeply relevant to this paper is what happened to the carbon cycle during that cooling period. Scientists monitoring the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, which tracks atmospheric carbon dioxide, they noticed an anomaly.
What kind of anomaly?
In the years immediately following Pinatubo, the rate of CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere actually slowed down. The global land carbon sink, basically the amount of carbon actively being absorbed by vegetation and soils, it got substantially stronger.
Wow. So nature has already run the experiment for us. When the sky got slightly darker from the volcanic ash, global carbon uptake by plants actually went up.
Precisely. The models aren't guessing. They're successfully reproducing that counterintuitive historical reality, which gives the projections for the year 2100 genuine credibility. They accurately reflect the baseline.
Okay, so let's talk about those year 2100 projections, because usually climate models give us this simple binary choice, right? We look at the SSP 585 world.
Worst case scenario.
Yeah, the high emissions, fossil fuel intensive nightmare where we just burn everything and global temperatures rise by a massive 6 degrees Celsius, just a literal planetary oven.
Right.
Or we look at the mitigation pathway, SSP 245, where we, transition to green energy, aggressively cut emissions, and stabilize warming around 3.5 degrees. But this paper introduces a sort of Frankenstein third option.
They labeled this third path G6 sulfur. And it is basically a synthesis of the worst elements of human behavior and the most extreme elements of human engineering.
Best of both worlds, or worst of both, I guess.
Definitely the worst.
Yeah.
In the G6 sulfur world, humanity completely fails to cut emissions. We just keep burning carbon, driving atmospheric CO2 to the extreme highs of that 6-degree worst-case scenario.
But the temperature doesn't hit 6 degrees?
No, because we deploy stratospheric aerosol injection to artificially force the global temperature down so it perfectly matches the cooler 3.5-degree mitigation scenario.
So we end up with a world choking on an unprecedented concentration of greenhouse gases, but artificially chilled by a sulfur shield.
Exactly. A high-carbon, moderate-temperature world. And that specific combination produces data that completely upends our conventional understanding of how ecosystems function.
So if we are spraying aerosols to block the sun, shouldn't plants, which literally eat sunlight, be starving? Let's look at what the models actually found, because intuition dictates that plant growth should plummet.
The big reveal in this paper shatters that intuition entirely. Under the G6 sulfur scenario, global net primary productivity, which is basically the total rate of plant growth, minus the carbon they naturally release back into the air, it increased by a staggering 15.6%.
Wait, really? Compared to the conventional mitigation scenario?
Yes, and global land carbon storage, the actual mass of carbon locked into trunks, roots, and soil, increased by 5.9%.
This sounds like putting a plant in a dark closet and watching it thrive. It makes no sense. How can less light mean more growth?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to look at the underlying biological mechanisms, specifically how plants react when you decouple carbon availability from heat. Let's look at the carbon side first.
Right, because in this modeled world, the atmosphere is absolutely flooded with CO2 since we never stopped burning fossil fuels.
Which triggers widespread CO2 fertilization. Carbon dioxide is the fundamental building block for plant life. When you massively increase its concentration in the air, you're essentially force-feeding the biosphere.
So plants can photosynthesize faster and grow larger just because there's more food available.
Exactly.
But, in the real world, force-feeding the biosphere with CO2 never works out this perfectly because a massive spike in CO2 inevitably brings extreme heat. And from what I understand about plant biology, extreme heat ruins the entire metabolic process.
The heat is the breaking point. To understand why, we have to look at the enzymes responsible for respiration. Both plants and the complex web of microbes living in the soil, they have to burn energy to survive.
Which is a process that releases carbon back into the atmosphere, right?
When global temperatures spike by 4 or 5 or 6 degrees, those respiratory enzymes are forced into overdrive.
So the plants in the soil essentially start hyperventilating. They are under so much thermal stress that they sweat out massive amounts of carbon just trying to stay alive.
Exactly. And that completely cancels out the benefits of all that extra food in the air. The heat stress triggers a catastrophic release of stored carbon. But the stratospheric aerosol injection fundamentally alters this dynamic.
Because by deploying the sulfur shield, we artificially suppress the global temperature.
Yes. The sun shield takes away the heat stroke. It separates the two variables. The plants receive the massive all-you-can-eat CO2 fertilization from the high emissions, but because the air is artificially cooled by the aerosols, their respiration rates remain low.
The enzymes never go into overdrive.
Right. The plants gorge on the carbon, and because they aren't thermally stressed, they actually retain it. They lock it into their biomass. That is how you get a near 6% increase in global land carbon storage in a darker world.
Wow. It is a brilliant, terrifying hack of the Earth's biology. We've hijacked the natural metabolic pathways of the biosphere. But taking this from a global average down to a specific critical region is where the research gets incredibly tense.
Oh, absolutely. The paper focuses heavily on the Amazon forest dieback.
which is this tipping point scenario where the rainforest gets so hot and so dry that it crosses an irreversible threshold. It basically turns into a savanna and dumps decades of stored carbon straight back into the atmosphere.
Forest dieback in the Amazon is one of the most perilous climate thresholds we are monitoring. The CMIP6 models in this study tested whether the G6 sulfur intervention could prevent that specific collapse.
And the localized data is pretty striking, isn't it?
Very striking. In the Amazon, the aerosol injection increased land carbon storage compared to both alternative futures. It was 8.6% higher than the medium emissions mitigation scenario and a massive 10.8% higher than the worst case 6-degree scenario.
So the sulfur shield acts as a protective canopy. It physically blocks the intense thermal radiation that drives the carbon loss, keeping the forest intact despite the catastrophic levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
It acts as a theoretical emergency brake. The models demonstrate that if we pull this brake, we can actually stop the total collapse of the Amazon rainforest.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We can't just hack the temperature without side effects. What happens to the rain? You can't just inject millions of tons of sulfur into the stratosphere without triggering massive geophysical side effects.
That's the catch. Changing the amount of sunlight hitting the Earth fundamentally alters the temperature gradients in the atmosphere. And that brings us to the behavior of the Hadley cell.
The Hadley cell being the major atmospheric engine driving tropical weather.
Exactly.
Normally, intense solar radiation hits the equator, heats the surface dramatically, and that hot air rises, right? It creates this massive low-pressure zone and drops its moisture as heavy tropical rain over places like the Amazon and the Congo Basin.
Right. And then the dry air pushes toward the poles and eventually sinks in the subtropics. It requires a massive temperature difference between the hot equator and the cooler poles to keep that engine running.
Okay, so you've got this thermodynamic driver, but then we introduce the stratospheric aerosols.
Yes. When we spray this reflective shield, it doesn't cool the planet perfectly evenly. It disproportionately cools the tropics because that is where solar radiation is most direct.
Oh, I see. By artificially cooling the equator, you reduce the temperature difference between the equator and the higher latitudes.
You weaken the gradient.
And if the temperature difference drops, the pressure difference drops. The updrafts weaken, the engine loses steam, and the entire tropical circulation system just slows down.
The atmospheric engine stutters. The direct result of weakening the Hadley cell, according to the models, is a global decrease in precipitation of about 6.4% compared to the high emissions world.
A 6.4% drop in global rainfall is catastrophic. But wait, if the Amazon relies heavily on immense amounts of tropical rain and we just crippled the global hydrological cycle, how did the Amazon's plant growth increase by 10.8%? A rainforest should dry out and die if you turn off the water.
That's a great question. The Amazon survives the artificial drought because of another profound biological adaptation, one that's triggered by the hyperconcentration of CO2. We have to look at the microscopic level of the leaves,
Okay, what are we looking at?
specifically water use efficiency.
Let's unpack that. Because plants breathe through tiny pores on their leaves called stomata, right?
Correct.
And to capture CO2 for photosynthesis, they have to open those pores. But every second those pores are open to the air, internal moisture evaporates and escapes. It's this constant trade-off between starving for carbon and dying of thirst.
In a normal atmosphere, yes. But in the G6 sulfur world, the atmosphere is oversaturated with carbon. The CO2 concentration is so dense that the plant doesn't have to open its stomata as wide or keep them open nearly as long to get the exact same amount of food.
Oh, wow. I see the mechanism now. If the stomata are mostly closed, the water stays trapped inside the leaf.
Exactly. The sheer volume of CO2 acts as a water preservation mechanism.
So the rainfall drops by over 6% globally. But the trees in the Amazon become so biologically hyper-efficient at hoarding their internal moisture that they don't even notice the drought.
The Amazon-specific ecosystem structure allows it to leverage that water use efficiency to survive the weakening of the Hadley cell. But, and this is a massive, but that biological armor does not apply universally.
The models reveal regional disparities, I assume.
Stark regional disparities. While the Amazon thrives, other vital ecosystems suffer devastating losses from that exact same lack of rain.
So the precipitation drop hits different biomes differently.
Dramatically so. The researchers highlight that in Indonesia, across Central Africa, and in the northern high latitudes, plant growth and overall carbon storage actually plummet under the aerosol scenario.
Because the vegetation in those regions either isn't dense enough or just isn't biologically equipped to stretch their water use efficiency far enough.
Exactly. The decrease in rainfall caused by the sun dimming is simply too severe for them. The plants starve for water regardless of how much CO2 is in the air,
The artificial cooling stabilizes South America, but it actively degrades the carrying capacity of Central Africa and Southeast Asia.
which moves us out of pure biology and into the terrifying reality of what deploying this technology would actually mean.
Yeah, we are talking about intentionally sacrificing the hydrological stability of one hemisphere to prevent the thermal collapse of another.
Is the ultimate global zero-sum game. The models prove that you cannot have a perfectly localized climate intervention. The atmosphere is an entirely interconnected fluid system.
And the researchers are incredibly stark about the limitations of this intervention. Even if we accept the regional sacrifices, stratospheric aerosol injection is not a cure. It is a temporary high-risk tourniquet.
A chemical bandage, really.
Right. We are suppressing the heat, but the greenhouse gases are still accumulating. The disease is still progressing underneath.
Which brings us to the most dangerous physical limitation of the entire concept, which is the termination effect.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener?
Well, the termination effect is basically the nightmare scenario. If you think of our atmosphere right now like a pot of water on a stove, global warming is slowly turning up the heat.
Yeah, and deploying SAI is like clamping a heavy lid onto a pressure cooker, but never bothering to turn off the burner.
The heat energy doesn't just disappear. The aerosols are simply holding the pressure back.
The physics of the termination effect are just brutal. If humanity starts spraying these aerosols, we commit to maintaining that shield indefinitely. And if we stop, say due to a global conflict, an economic depression, or just a failure in the deployment infrastructure,
The reflective layer in the stratosphere will dissipate in a matter of months,
so the lid blows off the pressure cooker.
instantly. All of the trapped thermal energy, decades of accumulated warming that we artificially suppressed, hits the Earth's surface in a single, violently compressed time frame.
So we wouldn't experience a gradual warming of 2 degrees over a century.
No, we would endure a catastrophic vertical spike in global temperatures in less than a year.
It's an ecological shockwave. The speed of the temperature change would fundamentally outpace the ability of complex life to adapt. I mean, you can't migrate forests in 6 months.
You can't adapt global agriculture to a sudden 3-degree heat spike either. The crop failures alone would be biblical.
The models actually show that the shock of the termination effect would be vastly more destructive to the biosphere than if we had just allowed the gradual, unabated warming of the worst-case scenario to happen naturally.
And even if we assume perfect execution, even if we build the planes, maintain the shield flawlessly for a century, and avoid the termination shock entirely, we still have to live permanently with a 6.4% drop in global rainfall.
Right, because the models focus heavily on plant carbon, but altering the fundamental hydrology of the planet impacts absolutely everything.
Yes, a drop in rain that's severe means devastating risks to human drinking water reserves.
It means chronic, widespread crop failures in the regions where the Hadley cell used to deliver reliable monsoons. It means accelerated soil erosion and vastly higher wildfire risks across areas that are suddenly permanently arid.
We are talking about artificially managing the life support systems of a chaotic, interconnected planet. The data proves we have the mechanical capability to force the temperature down.
But it also proves that we lack the ability to control the cascading consequences of that intervention. Imagine it's the year 2040, and the Amazon is on the brink of total collapse. This research shows we literally have a theoretical emergency brake we could pull to save it. But pulling that brake might shift rainfall away from millions of people on the other side of the planet.
The science works. The models validate it. But the impossible question is the geopolitics.
If stabilizing the climate in Brazil means inducing a decade-long drought in India or the Congo, who gets to keep their hand on the dial? If we possess the technology to artificially manage the Earth's life support systems, who gets to keep their hand on the thermostat? Who decides which hemisphere thrives and which hemisphere dries out?
It's a heavy, unsettling reality to process.
It really is. But understanding these exact mechanisms, the enzyme responses, the shifting atmospheric gradients, the terrifying math of the termination effect, it's essential. This technology is moving out of the realm of science fiction and into the hard data of Earth system models. And we have to understand the mechanics before we are forced to make the choices.
Absolutely.
Keep analyzing the data, keep questioning the systems around you, and keep diving deep into the source material. Thanks for joining us today.